What if a scientist proved our minds could connect across distance and then vanished without a trace? This is the story of Jacobo Grinberg, Mexico's missing prophet of consciousness, and the conspiracy that still haunts his name. I'm Arturo, and this is Latin Lore. From Latin America's history to mysteries and true crime, to local legends, whispering Latin intrigue, every tale is triple verified in archives before it reaches your headphones. Hit subscribe. Fresh revelations drop every week, ready for your next campfire debate. Today, I will tell you a story the way old people speak by the fire when the night smells of rain and copper and the dogs go silent, because something is moving out there in the dark that our eyes can't name. It begins with a man who believed reality was a weave and the mind its patient weaver. It ends with a locked door in Mexico City and a birthday cake that never got cut. In between, shamans and electrodes, prayers and Faraday cages, a president's sister and a woman called Pachita, who opened flesh with a knife that wasn't a knife, the tremor of a country between sovereignty and surrender, and a scientist who thought the truth could be measured in millivolts, until truth measured him and found him wanting. On the morning of December 8th, 1994, the phone rang and the world shrugged. By December 12th, when the family gathered to celebrate his 48th birthday, the chair at the table sat empty. He had vanished the way a spark vanishes into ash, without a trace and leaving only heat. A mystery that still haunts us. His name was Jacobo Grinberg Zylberbaum, born in Mexico City on December 12, 1946, the eldest of three, a boy stamped early by a loss that hollowed out the center of his house. When his mother died of a brain tumor, grief carved a question into him he would spend the rest of his life chasing. What is experience made of, and where does it go when the body fails? He grew up Mexican and Jewish in a century that didn't always know what to do with either one, caught between the reborn pride of indigenous Mexico and the far echo of Zion, between the pyramids of Teotihuacan and the mystic texts of Safed. As a teenager, he went to Israel, worked on a kibbutz near Gaza, fell in love with Lizette, and let Kabbalah lay its lattice of symbols across his restless mind. He kept his grandfather's prayer books by his bed and named the cabin he would later buy in Morelos, after the city of sages. The kid who watched doctors fail his mother was teaching himself to watch experience itself, to see if the world was something we noticed or something we built, stitch by stitch. This unique blend of scientific curiosity and spiritual exploration would come to define his life's work. In 1970, he left for New York and the Brain Research Laboratory at NYU, where Eroy John taught him to listen to the brain with wires and patience. He delved into the study of how simple shapes and colors leave fingerprints in neural currents, publishing respectable papers on memory, the caudate nucleus, interhemispheric correlations, the clean grammar of circuits and thresholds that science trusts. Then he returned home and built more than a lab. He built a shrine to a question. He set up psychophysiology labs at Universidad Anáhuac and then at UNAM. In 1987, when other men were drafting resumes, he founded the Instituto Nacional para el Estudio de la Conciencia, INPEC, a place meant to make consciousness submit to experiments the way cells submit to stains. He wrote like a man convinced time had its own vendetta against his hands. More than 50 books, some crystalline, some lurching, all circling the same spark. He started publishing Los Chamanes de Mexico, 6 volumes of field notes and nights under roofs where the rain beat hard, and he chased old healers not like an anthropologist carrying forceps, but like a pilgrim holding a candle. He was looking for a way to splice sovereignty, the ember that has outlived every empire, into the wires that fed his oscilloscopes. He wanted to translate the ceremony into an EEG. The state noticed. In the mid-70s, he was invited to Los Pinos by Margarita Lopez Portillo, the president's sister, and led to a woman named Barbara Guerrero, Pachita, who had sung in cabarets and sold lottery tickets, and who, people said, could open a body without anesthesia and close it without a scar. He watched her work. He wrote that she materialized tissue out of the very fabric of reality, from a grid he would later call the lattice. If that sounds like fiction, remember, he was trying to narrate what his instruments couldn't hold. Belief bends prose. The more he saw, the more he spoke of an informational matrix that shamans have access to, rewrite the body's code. Pachita, he said, hacked the weave. He also climbed the path to Huautla to sit with María Sabina, the Mazatec curandera, and let mushrooms pry apart the bolts of his composure. He wrote of cold fear, the street turning into a river, the animal wished to be home, reading on a sofa, and then of the sudden quiet after a storm in the head. San Pablo, she intoned like a drum. He thanked her for showing him his hideouts, the routes his mind took to escape the present. This is how he worked. One foot in the lab, one in the hut, and the rest of him hovering over a border that won't sit still, a journey that resonates with our cultural and spiritual roots. Back at UNAM, he paired up volunteers. First, he let them entrain, sitting together until their breathing found the same shore, then separated them into 2 Faraday cages and flashed light at one while the other sat in darkness. He recorded the visual evoked potentials produced by the flashes. He swore that later, in some pairs, a second signal, ghostly and late, appeared in the partner who had seen nothing. He called it the transferred potential. He reran the game, saw it sometimes and sometimes not, and in 1994 published what he thought was a pattern, an EPR paradox of the brain, with 3 co-authors in physics essays. Although it wasn't a top-flight neurojournal, the paper was peer-reviewed and still gets read. The claim, stripped of incense, was seductively simple. Under certain conditions, human brains entangle enough that a spark in one might sing in the other. His elders watched, intrigued and wary, as his methods blurred into his metaphors. E. Roy John, craftsman of clean waveforms, said the very tests that could have confirmed such a thing were well known and that Jacobo hadn't run them. Not because he was a fraud, John insisted, but because he wanted too much. Carl Pribram, the courteous skeptic who built the holonomic model of memory, visited Mexico City, looked, and said what careful scientists say when the breeze smells like revolution. If it's true, it matters. Now let's see it replicated. Later groups tried differently. A team in 2005 saw correlations at a distance, but not the faithful copy of the visual signal. In 2016, 16 researchers reported distant EEG effects between pairs, a suggestive glimmer rather than a knockout blow. Science, stubborn and slow, nodded politely and waited for boredom-proof replication that never came. The border he walked ran through institutions too. He pushed controversial extraocular vision trials with children, reading without sight. When visions turned ugly, parents yanked kids, administrators bristled, rumor multiplied like fungus after rain. The CIA's FOIA library would later contain bibliographies from Stargate that list his publications on Syntergy, remote perception, orbitals of consciousness, alongside other foreign work on PSI. That mention fed decades of conspiratorial folklore. But the files read like a librarian's drawer, not a kidnap note. He was on their radar because he was in the literature, not because a black bag team had him in their trunk. In Mexico, though, where the news is often a bruise, people remember the bruise, not the punch. Around him, the country's floorboards shifted. NAFTA took effect on January 1st, 1994. The Zapatistas marched out of Chiapas with old rifles and new words, telling the nation that progress without dignity is just a fresh mask on an old face. Jacobo signed letters, stood in marches, interpreted the rebellion through his lens, a people trying to take back the weave of their reality. Mexico answered with the cruelty of routine, political assassinations, a peso crisis, hunger in the air that tasted of paper and iron. Sovereignty was no longer a matter of maps. It was a matter of whose story counted as real. He began to fray. He said he was being followed. He slept, people say, in a van. Interviews turned grandiose and fevered. He described traveling through space by thought and surveying civilizations no one else could see. Some of it may have been metaphor, stretched until the skin gave way. Some of it may have been a mind seared by too much ceremony and too little sleep. Friends worried. Enemies chuckled. He had enemies now. Not because he was partisan, he never really was, but because men who straddle borders make both sides uneasy. He kept working. He planned an experiment to synchronize 2 brains across oceans, Mexico and India. He told his daughter Istusha he might go to Kathmandu for meditation. There is no airline record he ever left. On December 8th, 1994, he didn't come home. His colleagues waited. His assistant, Ruth Cherezo, kept coming to a lab that was emptying like a tide. His family set a cake on a table and listened to the city's murmur, trying to decide if hope was naive or necessary. Months later, when the disappearance finally became a police matter, Comandante Clemente Padilla, the Distrito Federal's best detective, took the case. He found loose threads enough to bind a country. Whenever he tried to pull, someone slapped his hand. Padilla's report reads like a chorus of almosts. After Jacobo vanished, his wife, Maria Teresa Mendoza Lopez Tere, cashed a check from a distributor for $1,000. She instructed a watchman not to return because her husband had initially flown to Guadalajara, then claimed he was in Campeche, and later stated they would fly to Nepal together. Calls placed in Mexico and the United States linked her to a night watchman with a paramilitary background. She was seen with a blonde woman at the house in Morelos, collecting her dog and a few ordinary things. And months later, on a beach in Rosarito, on Mother's Day, she called her mother. Then Tere vanished too. With each new lead came a hand on the detective's shoulder telling him to close the file. From very high up, he later implied, and the search dissolved into that familiar national solvent, the feeling that truth belongs to someone else. There were whispers of interference by someone linked to President Ernesto Zedillo. The whispers were never proven. They didn't have to be. In Mexico, an unproven whisper is as heavy as a bar of iron. Rougher theories swirled. In the early 90s, he met Carlos Castaneda, the desert fabulist whose Don Juan was a conjurer's elaborate mirror. They spoke. Castaneda's circle, says one witness, invited Jacobo to join. He declined. Later, he called the Peruvian an egomaniac. A student remembered Tere boasting of friendship with Florinda Donner, one of Castaneda's closest allies. A temptingly neat hypothesis bloomed: cultish revenge, the silencing of a heretic, but neatness is a liar. Still, the names keep returning, floating downriver with the other debris: the CIA, the Zapatistas, UNAM bureaucracy, NASA. An anonymous story about a man fitting Jacobo's description, boarding a small plane in the north and vanishing into the Rockies. Every legend learns how to breed. Inside the family, the gravity of the man remains. Estucia became a musician and kept his name flickering in the dark. Concerts called Syntergia. Interviews about a father who never came back. Shepherding 50-odd books into new editions 3 decades later. Outside, the legend got a fresh coat of varnish with Ida Cuellar's documentary, The Secret of Dr. Grinberg, which retold the case like a noir. A dogged cop, a missing scientist, a country that can't choose between waking and dreaming. The UNAM stories hurt the most. Colleagues who stayed away, students who wanted to continue the experiments and were told not to, indifference dressed as protocol. The file stayed open because the wound did. How accurate was his research? That is the briar patch, where sober men and mystics both leave skin. On one hand, Jacobo published legitimate early work on memory, basal ganglia, and interhemispheric EEG in established venues. On the other hand, the crown jewel, the transferred potential, remains a shimmering thing at the edge of the field of view, reported by his group, argued over by others, echoed at a distance by studies that see correlations but fail to reproduce the specific waveform copy, he claimed. That is not scientific damnation. It's the standard penalty for a bold claim. Extraordinary results must be boredom-proof, robust enough that hostile labs can run them drowsy on a Monday and still get the same curve. His weren't. And when he braided shamanic narratives into lab protocols, the credentialed world recoiled like a horse from a sudden shadow. Whether that recoil was prejudice, prudence, or both, belongs to the inheritance of any Latin American who dares to carry indigenous epistemology into a Western lab. What, then, is the truth behind the conspiracy? Or what? I give you 3 doors and the wind that whistles through them. 1, the private tragedy. A suggestible mind rides too many currents. Ceremony, fasting, insomnia, adoration, and slides into a paranoid spiral. He fears his wife. He talks of Kathmandu. He steps into the human fog where the disappeared go. Mexico is a country that knows how to make people evaporate. It does not always need the state to do it. In this reading, the conspiracy is only the conspiracy of indifference. 2, the intimate crime. A marriage riven by jealousy and money ends badly. The trail of checks, calls, cross-border movements, ordinary, squalid, unremarkable in a place where justice moves like molasses. The sudden disappearance of the wife writes the story for us. Stories are not verdicts. 3, the geopolitical ghost. A man who appears in CIA bibliographies, corresponds with Americans, entangles parapsychology with policy fantasies, crosses a line he doesn't know is there. A state with a long memory nudges him off the board. This version flatters our hunger for plots and punishes our patience. It lacks the one thing it would need: evidence. The truth may be smaller and therefore crueler, yet even if the man failed, the question did not. His Syntergic Theory borrowed from Bohm and Pribram to imagine a holographic order, a pre-spaced lattice in which the brain reads the world as pattern and then gives it heft, a cosmos where transparency and solidity are differences in organization, not essence. Maybe too easy a marriage of metaphor and math, but the ambition, Mexico's ambition, was honest. To refuse the colonial assumption that only one tradition owns the keys to reality. To say a Mazatec chant and an electrode array might be two instruments playing the same song. To insist that sovereignty encompasses not only land and law, but also the right to decide what constitutes knowledge. That is why the Grinberg mystery still throws a shadow. The terror was never just that he was kidnapped. It was that one more Mexican truth had gone missing and would not be returned. Some want him canonized as a prophet. They point to the CIA's Gateway Papers, to whispers of remote viewing, to 21st century unified field wool re-dyed as science. They say he was ahead of his time, that panpsychism is the future, that entanglement runs through everything from mitochondria to love, perhaps, or that is how we comfort ourselves when a story ends mid-sentence. He had published, he had failed to persuade the tribunal that matters. He had reached toward shamans and saints and toward a kind of science the academy does not yet know how to teach. He wanted the world to be one cloth. The cloth refused to lie flat. Look again at the calendar. 1994 was when Mexico cracked down in the middle. NAFTA opened the gates of the market as the EZLN raised a flag sewn from indigenous memory. Sovereignty was shouted in the streets and measured in pesos on the trading floor. Somewhere between those ledgers walked a short, bearded scientist who climbed the pyramid of the sun on Yom Kippur to speak to the god of Ezekiel, and then descended to sign funding forms and boot up his amplifiers. He was ridiculous and brave, and he belonged to us. When he vanished, the country saw itself in the empty space he left. That is why we keep telling his story, because in it we hear the fear of being remade by other people's stories, the resistance that refuses to forget, the memory that names the disappeared by their names, and the question of sovereignty deeper than any border. Who gets to say what is real? So this is my hypothesis, not because I love mystery, but because I love Mexico. I think Jacobo stood too long at a crossroads where science becomes right and right becomes science. And I believe his country's own crossroads between old and new, local and global, sovereign and sold, made that stance untenable. I think a human fracture, marital, mental, mundane, opened at his feet, and the institutions that might have saved him looked away. I believe the CIA files, the Castaneda anecdotes, and the calls from Campeche are like confetti a tragedy throws off as it spins. I think his experiments contained a kernel of something true, that brains do not live alone, and that he couldn't isolate that kernel from the myth growing around it. I think he paid for that failure with his life, though we do not know how or where the bill came due. And I think the debt the rest of us owe is to keep asking his question without burning down the lab or the hut to answer it. 30 years later, his books return to shelves, his daughter sings under his invented word, filmmakers keep pulling at the knot, newspapers rehearse the clues, and UNAM's corridors still carry a rumor that on some winter afternoon, a small man with a careful beard will open a door and apologize for being late to his own birthday party. I do not believe in returns like that, but in campfires and the old way of telling the truth, you circle it until it lets you closer. If you ask me what happened to the scientist who chased the lattice, I will say that the country claimed him the way forests claim bodies, slowly, patiently, making of him humus for new stories. If you ask me whether his research was accurate, I will say accuracy was never the proper noun. He attempted a translation, and translations are always treacheries. He wanted a Mexico in which the laboratory and the Maloca could speak as equals. He failed. The failure is ours too. And still, under the blackened sky, the weave hums, and somewhere, far from cameras and committees, two people sit together in the dark until their breathing finds the same shore. And for a moment, the mind remembers it is not alone. Muchas gracias. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell, because Latin America's darkest stories are far from over.